So let's talk about the collar. So the collar is going to get attached to the facing and to the jacket itself. To the facing will be the upper collar, and the upper collar is drafted here. So make sure that you have your fabric on the fold. Make sure that you have a notch for your shoulder. Make sure you have a notch where your lapel takes off, okay, which is actually part of the roll line at the end. And then I have my seam allowance all around. Make sure your pattern is neat. It's neatly marked. This is my tailored jacket. It's size 4. This is my upper collar that I'm cutting 1 in fashion fabric. Okay, easy enough. You've had all this before. So now what you want to do is to trace this pattern off onto another piece of paper. And now we're going to start making changes. What you're going to do is you're going to take 1/8 of an inch off along the top of the collar and down the side. So just on these two sides, you're going to take 1/8 of an inch off. I'm going to turn this upside down so that I can do it for you here. What this is going to do, as you know from your Flat Pattern 2 course, is it's going to shrink this pattern piece so that when you sew it, it pulls the top collar a little tighter. And the other thing that's going to make this pattern get smaller is this piece, which is called the under collar, will get pad stitched. So it will make it smaller by doing that as well, okay? So I'm going to take that much off this pattern. I'm not going to touch here, which is where it gets attached to the neckline. And then here at center back, I'm going to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now this piece is now going to get cut in 2. So this is going to become a cut 2 instead of a cut 1 on the fold. And I know that you again had this in Flat Pattern 2, so this is a little review. Okay, so now what I need to do is to go, this already had the seam allowance on it. I'm going to turn it around again. So I already have the seam allowance, and I know some of you were very anxious to get your seam allowance on. So I've already had the seam allowance on this. So what I can do now is to cut it out and just to add my seam allowance back on so that I know that I'm good to go. Okay, so again, I'm going to cut off at 1/8. I'm going to cut off that 1/8 of an inch. So now I'm really shortening up the collar 1/4 of an inch, right? Because the collar has 2 sides. And I'm making it shorter by 1/8 of an inch. This is going to give you a beautiful roll to your collar. So now I can go in and add my seam allowance back in. So you don't want to put your seam allowance, oops, I forgot, don't want to do that. Make sure that you get it all. I now have my 2 patterns for my upper and my under collar. I've marked my under collar. I'm going to cut 2 of fashion fabric, and I'm going to cut 2 of my horsehair. So I'm also going to go on, if you guys don't have a notcher, you should definitely buy one. So I'm going to notch my under collar. And now I'm going to double check my work by putting, either way, probably this way, I'm going to line up my upper collar along the stitched edge here and along my seam line for my under collar. And if I flip it over, I can see, might be hard. Let me zoom in a little bit. I think you can see it though. You can see the difference right along here. Move this over a little bit. So now I see that I've got the right amount trimmed off my collar. Okay, the next step I'm going to do is to transfer my roll line to my undercollar pattern, and you can do that with a tracing wheel if you want, or you can just mark it. Make sure it's lined up first. I know I'm going to my dot here. That's the line that's going to get transferred to the horsehair. So taking it straight for most of it, and then taking a nice gentle curve through and over to the notch. That's my roll line that can get transferred to my horsehair canvas. Okay, the last thing and the most important thing is to find true bias, which is kind of the nice thing about the dotted paper, because you'll be able to really see it and put in your bias grain line. You don't need a grain line on the other piece because it's on the fold, but you do want to make sure that you put a grain line on here because we want to make sure this piece gets cut on the bias. So I've cut out my undercollar and I've seamed it in the back my 1/2 inch, and I've given it a really good press to set it. Pressing is everything. Pressing and notches are everything in making this go more smoothly. So this piece I can put aside for the moment, and let's talk about the, oops, there's a mistake. Let's talk about the hair canvas. So now, first thing I want to do is to mark a 1/2 inch on where my seam allowances go. Draw the 1/2 inch with my tailor's chalk onto the horsehair canvas, because these are going to act as guidelines. Actually, the first thing you do before you mark, because if you press after you mark, it usually makes the tailor's chalk go away, which in most cases is the good news, but not for this step. So press, really press well to kind of, again, set your horsehair. So cut your pieces and press them really well. Then mark just the center back. And what you're going to do now is to overlap and match up your 1/2 inch seam allowance, as so. And then what I'm going to do is to go over to my machine and run a zigzag to put them together. So I've lined up my center back seam and overlapped them. I'm going to trim this off in a bit when I attach it to my undercollar fashion fabric. But first I want to mark where my roll line is going to be. So you can actually use your tracing paper and tracing wheel for this step if you would like. I'm not really a very big fan of that. So I'm going to now just chalk in my roll line. I've taken my information off my pattern. And I'm going to come over to here in a nice soft curve. Doesn't have to be exact. Okay, so now I have my roll line marked on my undercollar interfacing. Now what I'm going to do is to take my fashion fabric and place my horsehair interfacing on top of it, line up my seams, pin in it to hold it. Make sure that I've got it right. It looks good. And the next thing is to baste it with removable thread, so that contrasting color that hopefully you've been using, so you can pull it out, but we're just going to baste it so it stays in place. I usually baste along the roll line just because I like that to stay marked, and like I said, as soon as I hit the steam with the tailor's chalk, it tends to go away. So when I get to this point, what I want to do is to take the extra seam allowance and to trim it off. Not too close to the stitching. And I recommend a zigzag. Some people will tell you to double stitch it, like stitch the 1/2 inch straddle on each side. I like the zigzag stitch because it has a tendency to give you a little tiny bit more movement. It doesn't get so structured through the center back. It's a subtle thing, but it's just something I've discovered over time doing this. Okay, and then I'm going to continue. For me, I'm going to baste this in 2 places because I don't want it to shift. I'm going to baste it, for me, I'm going to baste it along the row line, and then I'll probably run another row of basting here. So I'm all basted, ready to go. So my next step is to turn it over onto the fashion fabric side. And I'm going to trim, again, because everything stretches. It's on the bias, it's loosely woven, so I'm going to trim back your horsehair. Of course, you're not going to touch your fashion fabric. You're just going to trim back your horsehair now that it's settled on to your fashion fabric undercolor. You're going to trim back all of your horsehair if it's stretched at all. Make sure, because what we're going to do next is to flip it over and to draw your seam allowance and remove the seam allowance. Okay, and then I'll trim this off, the top off as well. So I've chalked around my 1/2 inch. As I was chalking, I was reminded to say that, you know, pencils can make the biggest difference in your markings because of their thickness. And in the case where I haven't really, I'm kind of in love with my Taylor's chalk pencil. However, the downside is that it doesn't give me a very sharp edge. So what I have to do is to rely on the fact that when I trim something, that I have to trim it there, not on the other side, because that's really where the 1/2 inch is. So you have to think a lot about pencils when you're drafting as well. If you're using a really thick, chunky pencil, you're adding to your pattern. So just something to think about. And now what I'm going to do is go around and carefully trim off my seam allowance. And what I'm going to get is exactly the right shape because I've trimmed it and then marked the seam allowance. So now I'm going to get exactly the right shape. And then the next step will be to go in and to pad stitch the undercollar. So I've trimmed off my seam allowance on my horsehair, and now I'm ready to pad stitch. There are as many theories for how to pad stitch the undercollar as there are tailors in the world. So I'm going to show you this one. There's a lot others out there. If you do some research and you find something you'd like to try, they all seem to work. A lot you will see. I did upload a PDF of how my friend Kenneth does it, which is this concentric circle. You'll see a lot of tailors will start out with this really tight circle that happens through here, and then they spread out, they spread the arc out as the piece travels. I also see a lot of this two direction. The last time I tried this, I really liked it, so I think I'm going to go with this again and demonstrate this in this way. So I'm tacked down, and now I've gone ahead and marked on my roll line that is going into the neck. I'm at 1/4 of an inch apart. So that I'm going to keep really small and tight with my pad stitching. Here, I'm 3/8 of an inch apart. So from the roll line above, I'm at 3/8. From the roll line down into the neck, I'm at 1/4. So the nice thing too about this piece is that it's a lot easier to pad stitch because you can really hang on to it. You can really get in here and roll it, and you can really get a nice roll on this because it's a small piece. It's easier to handle. So what you're going to do is to pad stitch in this direction and then pad stitch in this direction on this. And again, I don't have to show you this. You know how to pad stitch now. You've done your 2 front lapels, and now it's time to do the undercollar, and then we'll get into setting this into the jacket.